Hi everyone, I'm Sue Cook and welcome to my YouTube channel, The Child Brain Whisperer. I'm going to read you a story that my dad wrote back in 1967. It's called Less Important Than a Pot, and it is about the earthquake that happened to us when we were in Venezuela. So I'm going to start from the top, except I think I've got the wrong glasses on, so sorry if I'm doing that with my varifocals. Less Important Than a Pot, The Earthquake We Were in Venezuela by Mick Ford. We were walking towards one of our favourite restaurants in Caracas, which is in Venezuela, when we first became aware of an ominous rumbling. It was July 1967 and we had just completed a 3-year contract installing generating equipment for the Venezuelan national telephone network. Our 3 years were up, and after having spent most of the contract working in the Andes, we were spending our last few days in a hotel on the eastern side of the city. We had made a lot of friends and we were enjoying repaying some of the excellent hospitality we had received, and had invited the Hickmots, a very nice Canadian family, out for a meal on this very evening. That afternoon, Wolfgang, another friend and colleague who lived in a block of flats immediately next to our hotel, had called to invite us to dinner with his family. We had declined as we had already made the arrangements with the Hickmots, but added that we would be delighted to go the following evening. We had left our 2 children, Anne, who was 4 years old, and Susan, who was just 1.5 years, with Maria, who had been our maid and child nurse for the past 2 years. George Hickmot and his wife arrived and we opted to walk the odd half-mile to the restaurant. We were about halfway there when the rumbling started. I knew what it was from similar experiences in other parts of South America. We froze on the spot and unconsciously forming a circle and putting our hands on each other's shoulders for support as the ground began to gyrate in unison with the rumbling, which increased and sounded like an underground railway train passing along underneath our feet. The gyrations increased in intensity, and also we began to find it difficult to maintain our balance. The ground moved in all directions and we were aware of nearby buildings swaying. Overhead electrical wires touched. Showers of sparks cascaded down like a miniature firework display, and pieces of masonry began to fall in a cloud of dust. Everybody froze, and even the traffic came to a standstill. The only sound I can remember apart from the awesome rumbling was a woman screaming in the distance. Slowly, the noise and movement subsided, and a deathly hush pervaded the atmosphere, and then pandemonium broke out as people came to their senses. Cars spun around in U-turns, drivers tore off to check their homes and families. In everyone's minds, the fear of aftershocks was great. When you lived on a geological fault, you knew the dangers very well. Our own fears were realistic enough too, the children. We looked back in the direction from which we had just come. A thick column of dust rose lazily into the air from precisely the point where our hotel was situated. We needed no bidding, and I can only remember shouting to Rosemary, "Scout's pace!" as we raced off. The Hickmots went off at a similar pace to where their car was parked. We were quite out of breath when we arrived at the hotel. Maria had the 2 girls standing on the pavement but looking very bewildered. Our Volkswagen Beetle was parked on a side street opposite and offered the safest haven for us. There would be no going back to the hotel, and the manager was already on duty at the door, preventing anyone from entering. Dust was settling everywhere, and I noticed almost casually that the block of flats next to us wasn't there any longer. It had collapsed like a pack of cards, and what was 6 stories high was now reduced to 1. A severe aftershock reminded me of the dangers of being in or close to a building of any sort, and I ushered the family into the car to relax and take stock of the situation. Police sirens, accompanied by those of the fire department and ambulance services, began to intrude on the other sounds as the city sprang back into life. The car swayed repeatedly as small aftershocks continued to rock the area. They would diminish in both magnitude and frequency as the night wore on. Meanwhile, I settled the family as comfortably as possible and went off to see what I could do to help. Devastation was everywhere, and I focused my attention onto the block of flats that had collapsed. Then the horror of the situation struck me. We had been invited up there for a meal and would have been there, but for a previous arrangement with the Hickmots. I went over to a dazed crowd that had gathered, and we were looking helplessly at the pile of rubble. My friend Wolfgang was among them in a state of absolute shock. "My God," I said as I put my hand on his shoulder. "Thank goodness you are all right." A stunned pair of eyes met mine. "Mick, my wife and 2 children are in there." It transpired that Wolfgang had popped out to get a packet of cigarettes from the local supermarket when the main tremor had occurred. What does one do in such a situation? In a futile gesture to appear helpful, I said, "Come on, let's start moving some of this rubble." At least it was something to do, and soon a chain of willing helpers had formed to help us move large chunks of rubble, and we were still at it when a JCB arrived to take over. I went back to the car pensively. Rosemary had got the children settled down and comfortably on the back seat of our Volkswagen Beetle, and we sat down in the front to marshal our thoughts. It was going to be a long night, and there wouldn't be much sleeping for anybody. The rescue services were in full swing by this time, and the radio stations were broadcasting minute-by-minute reports on the situation, and listeners were able to hear reassuring messages from relatives saying they were safe. "Mummy, I want my potty." It was Anne. Rosemary looked at me with uncertainty. The potty was in the hotel, and we were not permitted to enter under any circumstances. We tried to offer a few alternatives, but the potty would have to be. I went over to the hotel entrance and explained the situation to the manager. They shook their heads sadly and repeated the warning that the building was not safe and nobody was allowed to enter. In a desperate attempt, I asked them if they had children. They both nodded sympathetically and with an understanding look turned their backs to me and sauntered a few paces away from the entrance. Taking the hint gratefully, I went into the foyer and gingerly made my way across the reception area to the staircase. A thick veneer of dust covered everything and muffled my footsteps as I strode across to the staircase. Ominous cracks in the walls leered at me as I began to ascend to the first floor, where our room was situated. The power was off, and as I groped my way along the darkened corridor, a small aftershock reminded me that there was a good reason to move as fast as possible. The pot was neatly in its place beside Anne's cot, and I grabbed it, thankfully, before scanning the eerie darkness in search of any item of value. A packet of biscuits caught my eye, and I stuffed these and the pot into a small holdall before making a hurried exit. I had regained the foyer before coming to the sudden realization there was something almost as important to be retrieved, our passports. Reluctantly, I traced my steps to the stairs as another minor aftershock shook the building. The passports were on the dressing table where we had left them, and grabbed them gratefully. I returned to the foyer once more. Anne showed her appreciation and slept soundly on the back seat for the rest of the night. We'd been very lucky indeed, and later that day I was allowed back into the hotel to retrieve our belongings, which amounted to only a few suitcases, as most of our possessions had already been shipped to Canada, where we would arrive as landed immigrants in a week's time.